the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on a very popular topic, the Stonewall in the Dutch defense. It's a highly popular opening on club level especially because it's very universal. Black can choose to decide the opening very early on, pretty much on the first move, against almost any white first move other than e2, e4. Let's see first a classic game that has been played between former world champion Tigran Petrosyan against the legendary Viktor Korchnoi. Although I have to say that it was a very young Viktor Korchnoi in 1946. Let's see the starting moves of this opening. d4, e6. Of course, black usually starts with f5, but in many games they choose this move order, still giving white the option to transpose to an e4 opening by playing e2, e4 and transpose to the French defense. However, d4 players rarely switch over to an e4 opening. Knight f3, f5, and now the opening already is defined as the Dutch defense, although not necessarily yet the Stonewall. g3, the most common setup against the Dutch, knight f6, and bishop g2. And here black played d5, and now this is already defined as the Stonewall. When you see the pawn formation of these three pawns in such a shape, that's the Dutch Stonewall. What's good about it is that it gives black active play and a nice control of the e4 square. Black often likes to use the fact that the f-pawn has already advanced in order to bring the rook out potentially for an attack. Also, black likes to bring the queen after castling, of course, to h5, as we'll see in this game as well. However, in this game, we'll focus on the fact on how to play against the Dutch Stonewall. For now, white just castled, the most natural move, and black developed the bishop. And white played c4, temporarily sacrificing that c-pawn, although white would not have to wait long to regain the pawn, would black now capture the pawn on c4, because immediately white could respond with a check of queen a4 and then win the pawn back. And black played c6, now already threatening to win a pawn by capturing on c4, as after that queen a4 no longer would be a check. And here white played b3, which has several purposes. The obvious one is to protect the c4 pawn. But there is also a more hidden strategical idea behind it too. Namely, white is dreaming to trade off the dark squared bishops. Imagine if the two bishops on the dark squares would be gone, then only the other pair of bishops would remain, and that would mean that white would have a good bishop against black's bad bishop, being buried behind this chain of pawns on light squares. Therefore, learning from this example and some others over the years, today grandmasters already know better that it's best to try to prevent or at least delay significantly the bishop a3 idea of whites and put the queen on e7, guarding that a3 square a second time, making it more difficult for white to accomplish its goal. White would need to waste time one way or another, either by playing a4 first, or moving the bishop to b2, queen to c1, and then bishop a3. Any way you look at it, White will need to waste some time to accomplish that mission as of exchanging the dark squared bishops. However, back at that time, it wasn't quite as crystal clear as it is today that Black should avoid that, and Korchnoi in this particular game simply castled in this position, allowing bishop to a3. Just to give you an idea how important it is for White to try to exchange those bishops and to gain even better control of the e5 square, White often in similar positions would play even bishop to f4, allowing the doubling of the pawns on the f-file and open up somewhat in front of the White king on g1, the g-file. Let's go back. And in this position, White played bishop to a3. Black cannot escape the trade of the bishops because that would leave the rook hanging on f8. So Black traded on a3, at least to lure the White knight to an unattractive square along the edge of the board. And what are typically the plans of Black in the Dutch Stonewall? Well, the famous attacking ideas are, as I mentioned earlier, to bring the queen to h5 and then even oftentimes try to chase the White knight away from f3 and then bring the rook out to f6 and h6 and kind of try to create a brute force attack, checkmating White. However, I have to tell you that magic of such doesn't exist in chess. You cannot define the logic of chess. If one side has not broken any principles, any rules, there is no way that there can be punishment. Therefore, if White made all natural, developing, logical moves, putting the king in safety, there is no way that a brute force attack can just simply wipe White off the board. There must be a defense, and in fact, it's extremely risky for Black to put all eggs in one basket. Let's see how this game developed. Black made the typical queen maneuver, queen e8, aiming to go to h5. And White woke up and realized that the knight no longer has any duty on the edge of the board on a3 and improved its position by moving it to c2 with the idea to get to d3 to have further control of that crucial e5 square. And Black continued by playing queen h5, activating the queen, and White responded by playing queen c1. This is a multi-purpose move. On one hand, it prevents Black's g7, g5 move. As we'll see in some other variations, the queen may appear on a3 or after the trade of pawns on the c-file, as we'll see later in the game, the queen may come handy being on the c-file. Black here continued by playing knight to e4, preparing again, trying to play g7 to g5. The big difference between the e5 and e4 squares is that while the e4 square is in Black's control right now, and the e5 in White's, that Black can no longer attack that e5 square with a pawn. Therefore, the e5 square will be a long-term outpost for at least one of the White knights at a time. On the other hand, the black knight that just occupied that nice-looking e4 square can handily be chased out by pushing f2, f3 at the right moment. White continued with his plan, bringing the knight to e1, aiming to go to d3. Nimzowitsch wrote once his principle that strategically important points, which in this case is the e5 square, should be overprotected. You may wonder, white already has two pieces controlling that square, the pawn and the knight. Why does white need a third piece to control that square? Very simple. Because black is expected to play knight d7 in the near future to have a backup knight, so if one knight gets straight off, we'll have the option to put a second knight in its place. Nimzowitsch also said if the pieces are so engaged, they get their reward in the fact that they will then find themselves well posted in every respect. The game continued with black playing g5. This is a very risky move when you move a g-pawn in front of your own king. It's true that at the moment the position is relatively closed, but as we'll see, it will soon open up. And this should be a hint for you. When the opponent makes such a risky move, the first thing you should think about, how can I open the position so I can take advantage of this vulnerability of the king? And white proceeded with its plan by playing knight to d3. Black finally started to develop his queen side, and white responded by putting the knight to e5. You may wonder, does it matter which knight and why this knight? Well, the answer is simple to that. White wants to clear the f3 square for the f-pawn to be able to chase out the black knight from e4. This is also a pawn sacrifice, but accepting the pawn by capturing it with the queen right away would immediately lose material for black, because white would first chase the knight out from e4, and regardless where the black knight goes on the following move, white would play rook e1, trapping the black queen. Let's go back again to the game and see what happens after king h8. Now white was ready to play f3, chasing the knight back, which retreated to d6. And this is a key moment of this game. While white missed the objectively best move, what white did is very, very thematical and is the key idea to gain advantage when you play against the Stonewall. Let me first show you what was the move that Petrosyan missed. Although I have to say, it's easy nowadays to analyze games because computer programs immediately point out missed opportunities, especially tactical ones. Also, I have to add that nowadays the new generation who is growing up using chess computers from their childhood think a lot more concretely and a lot more tactically, just as computers do. In this position, the precise move was to play queen a3 and using the tactical opportunity that black has pieces on unprotected squares. Right now, the knight on d6 is attacked. It cannot retreat to e8 because then white would trade simply knights and the rook would be hanging on f8. And if the knight would move to f7 in this position, in that case, white would have another aggressive, ambitious move, attacking the black knight a second time on d7. The knight on d7 is busy guarding the rook on f8, therefore cannot move. And once the other knight trades on e5, white simply recaptures with the knight, renewing that same idea, attacking the knight on d7. The black knight is still busy guarding the rook on f8. The only way black can avoid losing even more material is by retreating the queen to defend the knight, but then all of a sudden the pawn on g5 remains unprotected. Quite a nice little tactic that was missed, but I want to show you the strategical idea that was very nicely illustrated in this game despite this tactical miss. Petrosyan here played e4, and that's the key idea. What white is trying to accomplish is that, for example, after this trade of pawns and an eventual trade between the d5 pawn and the e4 pawn, for example, after a trade on e4, white would continue by trading on f8, followed by queen to f1, and when black protects the knight, knight c5, and obviously the e4 pawn will be lost, and black will be stuck with a weak isolated pawn on e6 that still greatly limits the bishop on c8, and also it's quite clear that black's attack goes nowhere while the weakening on the king side is permanent. By the way, white also has additional good ways to continue after black would take on e4, also trading on d7, followed by the knight jump to e5, and then capturing on e4 also gives white a significant advantage. Let's go back again to the game. After e4, Korchnoi responded by playing knight f7, trying to trade off some knights. And now Petrosyan answered with the best move, trading on d5. If black immediately retakes on d5, the answer would be queen c7. A very powerful move. Finally, we see the queen in action on the c file, and with the rook coming to c1, black's position is not enviable at all. Let's go back again to the game. After cd5 in the game, Korchnoi traded knights on e5, and Korchnoi decided to keep the extra set of knights on the board and recaptured with the pawn. It's quite obvious that the black knight on f7 is in a miserable position, not having much perspective at all. Black recaptured with a c-pawn, and now the structure of the position has changed significantly. While until a few moves ago there weren't a single pawn change, it was a rather closed or semi-closed position, all of a sudden the position has opened up, which clearly favors white. On one hand, the black king is in a lot more dangerous position than white's king. Also, through these exchanges, black got stuck with a weak isolated pawn on d5, and also after the next move, white can create a protected passed pawn on e5. In addition, with this move, white just opened up a discovery with the bishop to attack the pawn on d5. If black protects this pawn with the bishop, white would immediately go after the bishop that's guarding the pawn, and after black would pin the knight, white would play simply getting out of the pin, queen e3, and renewing the threat on the bishop on e6. And of course the pawn on b7 would be hanging, in addition to the troubles that the pawn on d5 would face. Let's go back. After f4, the game continued by black playing rook to d8, protecting the pawn. But now the white queen is ready to be the hero in entering to black's territory. The big problem that black has right now is that his pieces are overworked. The knight is busy guarding the rook, the queen is busy guarding the knight, the rook is busy guarding the pawn, and that will be a major problem very, very soon. If black would play rook d7 right now, chasing the queen back, the queen would indeed retreat, but immediately threatening checkmate on f8, and at the same time with a fork of the pawn push, and of course just simply capturing the pawn on d5 as well. The game continued by black playing b6, with the idea to get the bishop out on a6. The problem now is that after pawn takes pawn, the ideas explained in the previous move come greatly to effect. The fact that the knight cannot capture the pawn because it's busy guarding the rook, the queen cannot capture the pawn because it's busy guarding the knight. So therefore, white simply won a pawn. If in this position black would play rook d7, white would handily gaining time, move the queen to c6, attack the rook, and after rook b7, give a check, and after e6, have a winning position. Let's go back again. And after pawn takes pawn, black played bishop to a6, attacking the knight on d3. Of course, after knight f4, in this position, the black queen is stuck. It can no longer hang on to the knight on f7, and therefore black resigned. A very instructive way on how to play against the Dutch Stonewall from white's perspective. Remember, one of the main ideas, try to exchange the dark squared bishops, and other than that, the main plan is to try to play f3 and e4. Of course, that's not to say that if you have some tactical opportunity on the way, you shouldn't look for it or you should skip it. However, you should be aware of what the correct plan is and then adjust it if needed. And now let's see the jewel of the week. This is a very old composition by the famous composer Stama from the 18th century. In this position, it's white's turn. It seems that black is winning. Black has an extra bishop and a very dangerous, far advanced passed pawn. Yet, with the correct sequence of moves, white can checkmate in 6 moves. Sit back, relax, and try to figure out that correct sequence. And the answer is rook e8 check, a simple check. Now black can block with the knight or the bishop. Let's start first with the bishop. Now the second check comes from g4, and the third with the pawn. And now white can afford to sacrifice the knight by playing f4, inviting king takes knight, h3, and finally the king has been chased to the edge of the board and white is ready to checkmate. Let's go back and see how white can win if black now blocks the check with the knight. The second move is the same, knight g4, king f5, and now the third move is different. First, we need to position the knight in a better place on f7. Of course, after king h5, again, rook h8 or even g4. And after king f5, an elegant sacrifice followed by a pretty pawn checkmate. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Remember the ideas I shared with you in the Dutch Stonewall. And of course, I hope you enjoyed, as usual, the jewel of the week. I promise you we'll come back to more ideas in the Dutch Stonewall. It's a very interesting opening for both sides. Thank you for listening and hope to have you back next week. So long until then.